We are now ready to start Session 1, the President's Panel Policy Issues and Strategic Challenges. A panel of presidents and CEOs of think tanks representing all regions of the globe will discuss multiple facets of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and give a grand overview of the current situation. While there are hopes and claims about the end of the pandemic, the troubling yet inevitable reality is that the world will need to accept transformation and adaptation in the wake of the changes made permanent, unfortunately, by the pandemic. Think tanks need to take the lead to accommodate and address these multi-sectoral changes in order to galvanize the policy community into action. The opening panel will explore the economic, public health, security, and social political impact of the COVID crisis on the world, and this will be followed by a Q&A session with the audience. May I please welcome the panelists to the stage to take their seats, please. Let's start with John Allen, the President, Brookings Institution from the United States of America; Carla Duarte, the Director of External Affairs, the Brazilian Center for International Relations; Diego Lopez Garrido, the Executive Vice President, Foundation Alternativas from Spain. Please make your way to the stage and have your seats. Sujan R. Chinoy, the Director General, Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis from India; Muhammad Abdullah Ali, CEO and President, Trends Research and Advisory from the United Arab Emirates; Milena Lazarovich, Co-founder and Program Director of the European Policy Center from Serbia; and Vaso Gwanden, the Executive Director, African Center for the Conservative Resolution of Disputes, South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, honorable guests, this session will be chaired by Abla Abdel Latif, the Executive Director and Director of Research, Egyptian Center for Economic Studies from Egypt. Carla won't be joining us, so Gustavo Martinez from Argentina is replacing Carla Duarte. Mr. Gustavo Martinez, thank you very much. I did the hard job. Well,
so this is our little secret.
So it's 10:05. You've got 90 minutes, inshallah, which will include the Q&A. Thank you so much. Good luck, inshallah.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Our little secret is that I asked him to do all the announcements and all the titles because he has this very elegant way of presenting names, okay? You must have been in the media business, and you are, okay, definitely. So he's definitely more capable than I am in introducing you people. It's great to be here. It's great to be in a lovely country like Bahrain. I definitely thank TTCSP and the Rasat for inviting me to participate. When late Jim told me about the event, I was very excited about it and looked forward to meeting him, but unfortunately things didn't go this way. But seeing all of you and seeing this event actually taking place as he wanted it to be, it's as if he is here, and I'm sure he is here with us in spirit. We have online with us, I hope, General John Allen. He's ready with us as well. Looking at the title of the conference itself, Global Trends and Transitions in Think Tanks, Politics and Policy Advice in the Age of Policy Dilemmas and Disruptions. Every word in this title reflects the importance of the situation that we're in, the urgency to do action, the urgency to work together, and the urgency for think tanks to take their place and play their role in advising policymakers and getting everybody together to face COVID-19, which I was hoping that as we meet today, we say it's becoming history. It's not history, it's very much present and even starting to have new nicknames, which I forgot at this point because there's so many of them. So it's continuing. This first session is sort of setting the stage for the rest of the conference. As you can see from the titles of the very distinguished panelists I have, and their regional representation, that we actually have the entire world with us between our great experts here and also the ones who are online with us. We have the entire world, and so the idea is to set the stage for the rest of the conference and understand what is going on in the world, the impact of COVID at all levels, political, economic, social, as COVID continues, what the impacts continues to be, and what needs to be done and what is happening in the different regions. Now, one of the things that Jim was very keen on is the time organization, and so we are going to stick to the schedule literally. Each one of the speakers is going to have a maximum of 10 minutes. I will be warning you 2 minutes before the end of your speech to make sure, just in case you are exceeding. In a conference I attended a few years ago, they did something very nice. They had actually 3 papers, 3 signs, one of them red, green, and yellow, and raising the sign would guide the speaker as to where he is in the status on time. It was fine and cute, but at the end people were following the signs more than the speeches, so it turned out it's not a good idea, but we are going to be very keen on sticking to the schedule. And let me start with General John Allen. I hope that he's online with us and ready for his first presentation or his participation in the session.
Abla, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, but I can see you. I want to see you. Yes, hello, hello, General. It's great to see you online. We met in Rome, and I was hoping to see you in person. Unfortunately, you're not here, but it's always a pleasure to have you, and the amount of knowledge you add from your participation is really significant. So please go ahead and start and give us your views.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And a very good afternoon to you all. If you're in Washington, D.C. with me right now, it's 02 in the morning, which makes this even a more fun event for me. But look, it's wonderful to be with you all today. And I want to thank the organizers of this event and just tell you how much I would love to be with you in person. It's been a long time since I've been to Bahrain and the region. But it is a wonderful area. The Kingdom of Bahrain is very precious to all of us who have ever served in the U.S. military, dear friends. And so it's a terrific opportunity to speak with you today. But before I begin, let me also offer my sincere condolences to Jim McGann's family and to all of those who worked with him at the TTCSP. And to his family at the University of Pennsylvania. Jim had this unique passion for think tanks, and he devoted his life to creating opportunities for think tanks to share and to learn from one another, including organizing a network of thousands of think tanks around the world. And Abla was right. As we come to you today, as you sit in Bahrain today, we're coming to you from around the world. That's a remarkable achievement by, I think, any standard. And Jim's vision and his expertise and his dedication created all this opportunity for us. We would not have all gathered here today, I'm almost certain, without Jim's will and without Jim's vision. And even though Jim is gone, and he will be sorely missed, in so many ways, the fact that we are together today gives us capacity for Jim to live on. And one of his legacies will be conversations like this one that we're about to have, where think tank leadership discuss their respective roles in the moment, in this moment, and developing policy options to deal with the near existential challenges that we face in our time, the pandemic, which is likely to convert into endemic in the relatively near future. I think we're going to have this with us for a very long time, if not forever. And then, of course, the other existential challenge that we face, climate change. And just these two alone have been the subject of many of these think tank gatherings. And I'm so glad that we're having the opportunity to kick off this gathering by talking about the role of think tanks, either as individual entities working within their countries or in teams to gather the kind of synergy that can occur from around the globe when think tanks can come together and share their lessons learned, but also, very importantly, to share the quality and the enormity of the scholarship that resides in think tanks around the world. We're truly living in an unprecedented age. And should we have convened just a few weeks ago, as the host of our session began, and as Abla said, we might have been thinking that we were beginning to see the end of the pandemic. However, we know that because many of the countries in the world have not come together and have not worked closely with the global vaccination program, we're going to see the kinds of variants that are now assaulting many of the countries in the world, Omicron in particular. We're going to see these variants for a long time. And here's another opportunity for think tanks to make the case for a global effort to vaccinate the people below the equator, the global south, so that we all share in this equally together and we can all have an equal role in healing the population. But still, despite the present challenges, global leaders, including the United States, have started to contend with what a new normal will look like and what lessons that we can learn from this health crisis. Now, let me talk about the US, because that's sort of why I'm on this panel, is to talk about the United States and perhaps North America, but the United States in particular. And since taking office, the Biden administration has made tackling COVID-19 one of its prime objectives, because it is at the heart of so many of the other challenges that we face in the United States today. President Biden, in his Build Back Better agenda, has envisaged a legislative framework that would invest into all aspects of society, such as healthcare access, education, and of course, COVID-19 relief. It would also renew America's commitment to fighting the effects of climate change and advancing equality and equity. And each one of these would have been important, but right now they're crucial because they've all landed on President Biden's desk at the same time. And many of them were exacerbated, many of them were accelerated by COVID-19, the very issues that cause us to gather today in Bahrain. Now, as evident from the current gridlock in the American legislature, our Congress, excuse me, the vision of Build Back Better is not shared across the political spectrum in the United States. Hyperpartisanship continues to plague not just the issues set out by the Build Back Better agenda, but many of the Biden administration's key positions, and I say positions, I mean leadership positions within the government, remain empty due to this hyperpartisanship. Many of our key leaders cannot get confirmed by the United States Congress. So not only does the agenda within the Congress in terms of passing laws become difficult, but having the American leadership in the seats necessary in the administration has become difficult as well. So issues like immigration and women's rights and voting rights, these are under intense debate in the United States today. Alongside the president's domestic agenda, he's taken some proactive measures, though, to uphold and to push forward a foreign policy that is values-based, it's transformational in its leadership, and is predicated on a U.S. commitment to human rights and democratic ideals and a commitment to operating multilaterally, putting diplomacy as the leading tool in our foreign policy instead of American military might. Now, we talked about some of this last week. Abla and I were together at the terrific MED conference run by ISPI in Rome. And these are issues that continue to come up over and over again as we consider what options we have as we move forward to come together as a community of nations, but also as a community of think tanks to make the kinds of recommendations necessary to leadership to embrace the change necessary to deal with these issues. Now, later this week, President Biden will engage leaders from across the world through something called the Summit for Democracy. And this two-day event will focus on three themes: defending against authoritarianism, addressing and fighting corruption, and promoting respect for human rights. And should President Biden be able to build a coalition out of this summit's participants, we will have the backing, I think, of like-minded countries on pressing geopolitical issues. And this isn't the end. This is not an exclusive organization. This is just the beginning of a conversation with a number of countries that have similar issues that they're dealing with and also similar values. And what we would hope is that this organization, it's not going to ultimately be an alliance or probably more than just a gathering periodically of like-minded states, will be able to address pressing geopolitical issues, such as advances in technology and dealing with the current and the future pandemics. And there will be future pandemics. And then some of the realities of climate change, which in Bahrain, I think just as here in the United States, climate change is truly becoming an issue in the center of most of our policymakers' thinking. And then, of course, the growing competition that we face economically and in security realms, et cetera, with Russia and China. Now, here at Brookings, this is a think tank summit. Here at Brookings, as a think tank, we've undertaken a number of key efforts in light of the crises that we're facing. And I have to say that while we call this a Brookings effort, and while you'll see Brookings as a title or a name on the covers of the materials that we've distributed, these have very much been multi-think tank evolutions within the United States, but also globally. And we're so grateful for some of the think tanks that are actually sitting on the stage today and in the audience for having joined us and helping us to put together these programs. And let me just talk about them for a second. I'm coming up on my time. First was Reopening of America and the World, a series of essays on the ways and means of reopening the United States and the global community from the pandemic. The other major project we undertook was Blueprints for American Renewal and Prosperity, addressing such issues as racial justice, economic growth, international security, governance, climate, and resilience. And later today, Brookings will kick off something called the Democracy Playbook, about committing to strengthening democracy and how we can work together with similar states around the world. And then we will engage after the president's gathering, something called the Global Forum on Democracy and Technology. So as Jim had envisaged, think tanks coming together and offering policy solutions to leaders today for these really urgent and potentially distressing problems. This is exactly what he thought. This is exactly why we're gathering in Bahrain. And this was exactly how we were able to move forward at Brookings with you as teammates and as colleagues to try to address some of these great challenges that we face today. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be with you. I'm so sorry I'm not with you in person. And I also lament the passing of my dear friend, Jim McGann, but I wish you all continued good health. And I'll turn the floor back to our esteemed moderator, Abla.
Thank you so much, General, and thank you for sticking exactly to the time. This was perfect. And I definitely second everything you said related to the vaccination of the South. We are all in the same boat. If we all don't get vaccinated, even the Western world that is doing better than the rest will not be safe. The important issues of democracy, human rights, the climate, the technology, key issues that, if addressed correctly, will improve our possibilities and our ability to cope with this pandemic and future pandemics in the future for sure. We now move on to our second speaker, Mr. Gustavo Martinez.
Hello, everyone. Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, I want to start again. I was telling that it's a pleasure to see all of you here again after some years. Especially I want to remind Jim McGann was a friend for me, for many of you, I'm sure. I'm thinking we're here to follow his legacy, and I'm sure as well that he's here looking around now, that checking that everything is okay. In my case, I have to talk about our region, and it's ironic, but I have to speak replacing Carla. She is from Brazil, I am from Argentina. And you know, I think there are not two countries with so different point of view or way to act in during the COVID process, no? Because I heard in my country something that a doctor said, that when politics gets into health lose. And that will happen in my country, I think in my region, and I think in in all around the world. Because, for example, in our countries, the politics and the ideology in Brazil and Argentina are very different, but finally the result was the same, was a bad result. Many people die, and that's what happened, I think, in the rest of the world, but especially in our region, because the COVID came to put on the table the disparities and the inequalities that in our region there were, no? But this was before the pandemic, because we must think especially about the causes and not the symptoms. And that will happen we knew before that we have many poor people. We knew before that we had problems with in our economy. And especially we learned that we had problems in our education, and the disparity is enormous. So the COVID, okay, we have to face the COVID, and we are facing now, but the problems still there, and the problems are going to still there after the COVID. So the situation now is now we are in something like a spring, but we don't know until when. So, but we have a lot of deaths. There is a big disparity among people who were vaccinated and are not, especially in countries. For example, in my country, I have, for example, 2 doses, and I received today in the morning the news that I'm going to take the first doses soon. But what happened in other countries, the percentage of people that were vaccinated is very, very, I can say that, there are not many people that were vaccinated, and this is a big disparity. And what is happening in our region, but this happens always, not now. The COVID put the truth on the table. That is happened really, and so I think that we must now to think about what are going to do in politics with a real health policy, but we don't know exactly what happened. The economic and the political situation in our region is very weak. So, and for example, people are very angry with the politics, and we can see what happened in Argentina or in Chile with elections. The officialism, the government, they lost the elections. People are really angry. So, but we don't know what happened with the next government, because, as I said before, it doesn't matter how important the symptoms, but the important are the causes, no? What happened before the whole process in our countries. So we'll see. We have to work together for a better future and be aware to face this kind of problems that we are having now. But we have permanent problems in like poverty, the education. For example, the education in our region now. Through the COVID, you can see the despair situation, no? And for example, I'm very worried in my region about what's happening with education, because the COVID pandemic, for example, my kids, they had lessons during the whole year, but there were a lot of children that they had not classes, for example, and the disparity between people who has internet, and in Argentina and in the region there are people that do not have internet. So they had not access to internet. So this is a big difference between this difference is going to be very important in the future for the people and for us. So I'm worried. So I think I am here to try to listen to my colleagues, to know more about solutions, but especially to know more about how to work seriously. Because what I said at the beginning, when the politics gets into health loose, and that happens in all orders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gustavo. You raised a very, very important point that is valid in Latin America and valid actually in most countries in the world. Problems existed before COVID. Problems of poverty existed before COVID. Problems of structural deficiencies, institutional problems exist in all countries. And they were not addressed, but it's urgently needed to address them now. Because if we don't, then the problems will continue. All what COVID did is make it big and clear that these are urgent and important matters. That's the thing. It's not that COVID brought problems. The problems were there, just made them clearer. And this is a very, very critical point. So thank you for your talk. Mr. Diego Lopez Garrido from Spain, please.
Thanks, Abla.
Thank you.
Thanks to the Bahrain Center for Strategic International and Energy Studies, the RASAT, and Lauder Institute's think tanks and civil societies program in the University of Pennsylvania, organizers of the 2021 21st edition of the Global Think Tanks Summit. And thanks to Jim McGann, I'm deeply shocked and sad by the unexpected death of Jim, the soul of our meetings, the father of international think tanks. And I thanks to his team for maintaining this event in Bahrain, which is paying tribute to Jim and a token of gratitude. This first session, as Abla announced, is dedicated to the economic, political, and social impact of COVID-19 all over the world, and mainly, in my case, in Western Europe. I'm going to tackle three perspectives: the current situation, the forecast for the future, and the role of think tanks in this issue. The current situation is centered, everybody knows, in the search of a new strain called Omicron. There are many questions around Omicron. Rise in infection, more transmissible, can it evade the immunity conferred by previous SARS-CoV-2? Does it cause more severe disease? Many, many questions. But the World Health Organization says that it would take at least 2 weeks to understand the effects of the variant on vaccine. Which are the facts? From a social point of view, in Europe, in Western Europe, Europe has been well protected. The complete vaccination is now between 60 and 70% of population. USA goes after. Latin America, only 37% of population vaccinated a jab. Asia has a global date of 27% population vaccinated. In Africa, only 3.6% of 1.4 billion of Africans has received 2 jabs. There is a paradox because Western Europe is nowadays the core of the new surge of pandemics. Between the 1st and the 7th of this month, December, the European continent suffered more than 60% of new infections in the world coming from COVID-19, and 55% of deaths linked to the pandemics following the Health World Organization. We can differentiate 4 groups of countries in Europe. East countries, the strongest affected because low vaccination. South and Southwest countries in better situation, for example, Spain, Portugal, Italy. Nordic countries are in the middle, and United Kingdom has a particular situation, high infection in United Kingdom, but stable. Other aspects of human health face collateral damage, increasing mental illness, particularly the young, and devastating effects on cancer because of the priority for the medical battle against COVID-19. From the angle of economy, many European countries have provided a crash course in a non-new experience, shortages of basic goods. That is scarcity. The disruption led to delays in shipping, problems with electronics, semiconductor shortage, etc. Politics, negationism, growing resistance to restrictions is creating a new political space for the politicians of the right and left, anti-establishment. Populist parties are rethinking their strategies. For example, anti-lockdown libertarianism, not only in Europe, but in the United States as well. Health disinformation, another fact. Health disinformation, misinformation, false reports related to pandemic. It's the specter of a shadow plague in the first great pandemic of the digital age. There is some reaction coming from social media giants, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook. From the perspective of future decisions to adopt. Second perspective, the experts agree. Vaccination is necessary, but it's not enough. It's not enough. We need to avoid lockdowns, for example, mandatory restrictions, medical controls, vaccine passports, or COVID certificate, Green Pass, which is a measure pushing the vaccination and travel, with some problems of discrimination.
Oh, excuse me, I have 2 minutes to go.
Okay, thank you. Mandatory vaccination, there is a debate about mandatory vaccination. It's very important in Europe because Europe is based in free movement. Because for that reason, it does exist digital green certificate. Omicron. We have no time to wait for data on Omicron. The situation could develop quickly over the coming weeks. Politicians cannot wait for new research on the Omicron variant and must act now to prevent a potentially very significant wave of infections. Last perspective on think tanks' role. We think tanks, should translate our advice to the public opinion. I emphasize 3 questions. To recommend vaccination, fighting firmly the anti-establishment attitude of negationist groups. Vaccination is not just a personal decision. Second, Health World Organization officials say the priority should be to vaccinate everyone in the world. We have to feel the vaccine gap suffered by the world's poor. It must be a priority for the rich nations. And I finish with a statement by Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, former Finance and Foreign Minister of Nigeria. You are not safe, even in a rich country, with all your people vaccinated, until everyone in the poor countries are also vaccinated. We have to require governments to increase health spending even faster than previously planned. To end, Abla,
Thank you.
there is a global problem. It's not an Indian, African problem. It's a global problem.
Yes.
The next week, G7 finance and development leaders meet in Liverpool. We think tanks coming from different corners of the planet should send a clear message asking for solidarity with the world, with all the world. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the excellent presentation of the health situation, not only in Western Europe, but in the world. The vaccination gap is a very serious issue, and your call for global attention to filling this is the primary, #1 policy action that needs to be taken. And in it is a change of attitude, actually, for the Western world in seeing their interest in isolation of the rest. We are all literally in the same boat. If we do not pay attention to Africa, if we do not pay attention to the poor, which is something that we should have done forever, okay, now it's going to backfire on the West. It's very simple and very straightforward. Thank you so much. Now we move on to Ambassador Sujan Shinov. Please, Shinoy. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. I'm
Yes.
not as good as our very eloquent.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Abla. And let me begin by thanking Derasat as well as the University of Pennsylvania for this very warm invitation and excellent hospitality. I think this is a very good occasion for us to review the way things have evolved since the pandemic struck. And I should begin by stating the very obvious proposition here that if a fragile international consensus that was also already greatly weakened by friction on issues such as trade and technology, more particularly because of friction between the United States and the People's Republic of China, has actually become even more devastated and weakened. There is contestation, as we have seen, on almost all the vectors that we know that have made globalization a success story. So we see that there are problems with trade, there is a problem with technology, there is a problem with movement of capital, there is a problem with movement of human resources, people movement, and this has been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. Today I would see the spectrum of conflict evolving on 4 T's, essentially: trade, technology, territorial differences, and certain other challenges such as terrorism that have continued. There is also a 5th contestation that's evolving on the T of tenets. This is about global governance and developmental models. There are different narratives that have been coming up. On the United States side, there is this concert of democracies that's going to be held soon. The Chinese have been propagating their own model of governance and development. There is also an emerging contestation between interpretation of what is a rules-based order. Is it rule of law or is it rule by law? And I think the Chinese have come up with their own idea of rule by law, for they believe that a rules-based order is essentially something that they did not participate in the creation of. Now, today we can happily say, or rather regretfully say, that the world is neither unipolar nor bipolar nor truly multipolar. That multi-alignment is on the rise, that multilateralism is greatly weakened. From an Indian perspective, a country that has 1.35 billion people, obviously the pandemic was a huge challenge. You may be aware that India has successfully administered 1 billion plus doses to its people, and that essentially means that upwards of 1/3 of its population, nearly 40% now, is double vaccinated. The role of the armed forces was tremendous. It was a splendid job that they did in creating the kind of infrastructure to fill in the gaps between what was available and what was truly required. Now, 97.5% is the recovery rate in India, and that's truly amazing. It's just 1.5% that's the mortality rate. And we are currently engaged in negotiations with 100 countries on vaccine recognition. The GDP is growing back to its normal rates, 8.4% in the 3rd quarter, expected to be roughly 9% next year. Looking out from India, I think there were 3 main challenges that appeared alongside the onset of the COVID pandemic. The first is the tremendous geopolitical flux in Afghanistan, where we have seen the return of the Taliban regime, and this time for the Taliban as well, the shoe is pinching on the other foot, for as they attempt to normalize themselves and be normalized by others, they are also facing the challenge of the Islamic State Khorasan. From India's perspective, the priority is to preserve our traditional civilizational link with Afghanistan, to give them humanitarian assistance, and to also ensure that our role there as one of the key supporters of Afghanistan's reconstruction, with over $3 billion having been spent in this regard, continues. And we are looking at providing 50 million tons of wheat and other humanitarian assistance. Pakistan has also agreed to provide us transit for this particular matter. The key challenge here is that the global community, the regional community, wants to ensure that terrorism or radicalization does not make a comeback into Afghanistan, and that we can devote our energies to the betterment of the people of Afghanistan through transparent humanitarian assistance. China's rise is the other big challenge. Its unilateralism is felt from the East and South China Seas all the way to the high Himalayas, where last year it was almost as if the Chinese timed their aggressive intentions in the Himalayas with the onset of the COVID pandemic. That was met with a very robust military response on the part of India, and we are currently engaged in dialogue to see how best we can reduce the border tensions. There is then the great churn that's taking place in the Indo-Pacific, where there are structures such as the Quad, the Malabar, AUKUS. All of them reflect a certain sense of insecurity that has crept in. The notion of the Asia-Pacific had a shelf life from the end of the Second World War till the end of the 20th century. Today, with growth spreading beyond East Asia, beyond Southeast Asia, beyond the Pacific to the Indian Ocean, all the way to the east coast of Africa, we are looking at a more inclusive concept known as the Indo-Pacific. The focus will remain on the role of middle powers and what they can do to fill in the gaps. So we cannot leave it to the United Nations or to multilateralism. We cannot simply be asking the wealthier countries to pump in money. The larger economies in the region, such as Turkey in its own area, India, Australia, South Korea, Mexico, all of these will have a role to play to ensure that others in the region are also carried along. And I dare say that India has been looking at its own region in the context of the neighborhood first policy. We have also successfully implemented our vaccine Maitri policy, which is to share the fruits of our own vaccines. We have two of them, the Oxford AstraZeneca's Covishield and our own Bharat Biotech Covaxin. We've already shared 70 million doses of these, of which around 11 million were gifts. The rest were part of COVAX and commercial deals. May I say that critical supply chains, especially in the healthcare sector, are a very, very big challenge and will remain so for the foreseeable future. When you look at any statement that's coming out today, whether it's the G7+3 or the D10, if you wish to call it that, or the Quad, you will see that there is mention of critical supply chains, there is mention of the healthcare sector. Within the context of the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue structure, India, Australia, the United States, and Japan are also working to promote the availability of vaccines. We are committed to giving roughly 1.2 billion doses to others, using essentially US technology, Japanese funding, Australian marketing, and Indian production. And it also is really an example of how we can work together. And the Quad focuses on these capacity building aspects. Broadly speaking, these are the challenges, and I feel I should end by simply mentioning that economic recovery at this stage remains a priority for all of us, no matter which part of the world. Healthcare infrastructure should be developed with redoubled vigor. And as a previous speaker also mentioned, we must all remember that nobody is safe till everybody is safe. We must review the role of financial institutions, the role of the larger economies, above all the role of think tanks. I think the one silver lining that I see in the COVID pandemic is that it has brought us all closer together, and that the tyranny of geography and distance of different time zones and travel no longer comes in the way of our talking to each other, ensuring that we can do so even in a hybrid manner. And this really means that we are already having a much deeper dialogue on all that can possibly unite us, all that does continue to divide us. So let us all work together on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very interesting, and I'm glad that the health situation in India is better. I remember India was one of the cases that were badly hit at the beginning. The Indian ambassador in Cairo, I met him early on, and I was asking about the number of cases on a daily basis of death. And at the time, it was 100,000 cases per day, which is a very, very, very scary number. Given the size, of course, of India and its population, it's understood, but then hearing the number was scary. So glad things are a lot better, and you gave us a great navigation through the geopolitical situation. And it's as if on top of COVID, we need the issues with Afghanistan, and we need the new challenges with China. So hopefully things will get better. You raised the point also of the critical supply chains, which is very, very important, faced at every level, but particularly critical in the area of health, because it's a top priority for the world. Thank you so much. We are going to move now to Dr. Muhammad Abdullah Ali. And I tell the audience that the presentation is going to be in Arabic, so please use your headsets for translation if you need translation. although I'm sure that all of you, given that we're in Bahrain, you already know Arabic and can manage very well. Dr. محمد.
شكرا.
Yes, only one.
اليوم بس يحطوا نحطوا بس السماعات.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Let's give them a minute. Just make sure. Do you all have your headsets on? Yes? Okay. Please, تفضل يا فندم. 10 دقايق.
إن شاء الله. شكرا سيادة الرئيس الدكتورة عبلة على إدارتكم لهذه الجلسة، والشكر موصول إلى شركائنا في مركز دراسات في مملكة البحرين الشقيقة، وعلى رأسهم الدكتور الشيخ عبد الله بن أحمد آل خليفة، وشركائنا في برنامج مراكز الأبحاث والمجتمعات المدنية في معهد لودر في جامعة بنسلفانيا، على هذه الدعوة الكريمة الموجهة لي للمشاركة في هذه القمة العالمية أو هذا الملتقى العالمي لمراكز الفكر. واسمحوا لي بداية أن أجدد التعبير عن حزني وعزائي العميقين في وفاة الصديق العزيز والشريك القوي لنا في ترنز للبحوث والاستشارات الدكتور جيمس ماغان، الذي وهب حياته حتى آخر لحظة من أجل خدمة مجتمع البحث العلمي وتعزيز التعاون والحوار بين المراكز الفكرية بما يخدم المجتمع البشري. كما أقدم خالص مواساتي وعزائي لأسرته ولجميع تلاميذه ومحبيه ولشركائنا في معهد لودر وجامعة بنسلفانيا ولكل مجتمع مراكز الفكر العالمية في فقدان هذه القامة التي يصعب تعويضها، مؤكدين حرصنا في ترنز على مواصلة التعاون مع برنامج مراكز الأبحاث والمجتمعات المدنية وكافة الشركاء لاستكمال مسيرة تعاوننا بما يحقق الهدف الذي كرس الدكتور ماغان حياته من أجله. مداخلتي ستركز باختصار على شقين. الأول سأقدم فيه لمحات لبعض التأثيرات التي خلفتها جائحة كوفيد-19 على الأوضاع العالمية عامة ومنطقة الشرق الأوسط خاصة. أما الشق الثاني سأتعرض فيه لبعض الأفكار التي أعتقد أنها مهمة في سياق تحركاتنا المشتركة لتعزيز دور مراكز الفكر في مرحلة ما بعد كوفيد-19. أولا، بخصوص التداعيات التي خلفتها جائحة كوفيد-19، لم يعد خافيا على أحد منكم التأثيرات العميقة التي أحدثتها هذه الجائحة في كافة مناحي الحياة، سواء كانت الحياة السياسية والاقتصادية والصحية وحتى الأمنية والعسكرية. أصبح مصطلح عالم ما بعد كورونا متداولا على نطاق واسع، وأصبحنا نتكلم عن نطاق عالمي جديد مختلف عما كنا نعيشه قبل الجائحة. فعلى الصعيد الصحي الإنساني، أظهرت الجائحة أن فعالية النظم الصحية المطبقة في غالبية دول العالم بما في ذلك الأكثر تقدما محدودة في مواجهة خطر الأوبئة واسعة الانتشار، وهو ما يفرض إعادة النظر في النظم الصحية المطبقة في كثير من هذه الدول. أما على المستوى الاقتصادي، رأينا كيف أدخلت جائحة كوفيد-19 العالم في أسوأ موجة ركود شهدتها منذ ثلاثينيات القرن الماضي، بعد أن تسببت في إغلاق الكثير من الاقتصادات العالمية وتعطيل قطاعات حيوية مثل السياحة والسفر والتجارة الخارجية، وهذا ساهم في انضمام عشرات الملايين حول العالم إلى صفوف البطالة والفقر، إضافة إلى تعطل سلاسل الإمداد حول العالم التي تسببت في مشكلات كبيرة للدول التي تعتمد على الواردات وخاصة السلع الحيوية مثل المواد الغذائية وأيضا المواد الطبية. أما على المستوى الأمني والاستراتيجي، رأينا كيف غيرت الجائحة نظرتنا إلى مفهوم الأمن الوطني والعالمي الذي كان يتركز على امتلاك القدرات والتقنيات العسكرية والأمنية، حتى اكتشفنا أن توفر جهاز تنفس صناعي كان بالنسبة لبعض الدول أكثر أهمية من حماية أمنها في امتلاك سلاح دمار شامل. بمعنى آخر، صعدت قضايا الأمن الصحي والإنساني تصبح ضمن أولويات الأمن الوطني في كثير من دول العالم. الحديث هنا يمكن أن يطول لساعات، وقد نشرنا بالفعل في مركز ترندز عشرات الدراسات التي تناولت مختلف جوانب هذه التأثيرات لجائحة كوفيد-19، ولكني أود أن أختم هذا الشق في مداخلتي بالإشارة إلى ملاحظتين مهمتين. الأولى أن تأثير الجائحة على منطقة الشرق الأوسط ليس واحدا بما ينطوي على تباينات كبيرة، فنحن بصدد منطقة شديدة التباين في ظروف وأوضاع دولها. فهناك دول نجحت في التعاون بحكمة مع الجائحة وتقليل خطرها، مثل دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة التي قدمت نموذجا راقيا في التعاون مع الأزمة، في حين كانت الدول التي تعاني من الصراعات والأزمات وحتى المشكلات الاقتصادية قبل الجائحة أكثر تأثيرا، لأن الأزمة فاقمت من تدهور الأوضاع الاقتصادية والصحية والإنسانية في هذه الدول. أما الملاحظة الثانية أن التأثيرات ليست كلها سلبية، فالجائحة أظهرت الحاجة للتعاون بين الدول والشعوب في مواجهة التحديات الكونية الخطيرة، وهو ما انعكس في تراجع وتيرة الصراعات في الشرق الأوسط. كما أظهرت الجائحة نقاط الضعف التي يجب على الدول أن تأخذها في عين الاعتبار عندما تخطط للمستقبل. وهنا أنتقل للشق الثاني في مداخلتي هذه، وهو ماذا يجب علينا نحن في مراكز الفكر أن نعمله في ضوء التأثيرات التي أفرزتها هذه الجائحة. ودعوني أشير هنا إلى 3 أمور رئيسية وهامة. الأول أن جائحة كوفيد-19 قد غيرت ويجب أن تغير تفكير وعمل مراكز الأبحاث لتواكب التغيرات اللي حدثت بالفعل في العالم كله بعد هذه الجائحة. وأشير هنا بصورة خاصة إلى ضرورة إيلام اهتمام أكبر على قضايا الصحة العامة والبيئة والتنمية المستدامة، وأيضا توجيه صناع القرار والسياسات إلى التحديات التي تفرضها هذه القضايا والتي أوضحتها بجلاء جائحة كوفيد-19، وأن تسهم في إيجاد حلول مبتكرة وخلاقة لهذه التحديات والقضايا. أما الأمر الثاني هو ضرورة تعزيز مراكز الفكر والبحوث لدورها في دعم الجهود الوطنية والدولية للتعاطي مع التحديات التي تفرضها جائحة كوفيد-19 وغيرها من التحديات الناشئة، وأن تكون شريكا مسؤولا في هذا الأمر. ودعوني أشير هنا إلى تجربتنا في مركز ترندز للبحوث والاستشارات أيضا في دعم سياسات مواجهة كوفيد-19. فمع تأكيد حقيقة أننا مركز بحثي مستقل، إلا أننا تمكنا من خلال العمل الجاد والمصداقية اللي اكتسبناها خلال السنوات الأخيرة طبعا في عملنا البحثي، أن نكون شريكا أساسيا ومهما للهيئة الوطنية لإدارة الطوارئ والأزمات والكوارث في دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة، التي تتولى بصورة أساسية ملف إدارة أزمة جائحة كوفيد-19. وقمنا باستطلاع واسع للرأي العام لمصلحة الهيئة لمعرفة آراء المشاركين فيها في دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة حيال أزمة فيروس كوفيد-19 وما هو تأثيرها الصحي والاجتماعي والاقتصادي على المجتمع. وكان طبعا لنتائج هذا الاستطلاع دورا مهما في إعادة توجيه بعض السياسات الحكومية في مجال مكافحة كوفيد-19، كما أن مجال تعاملهم مع الهيئة تواصل في مجال الاستشارات والأبحاث الأخرى. ويفخر ترندز أن يكون له بصمة ولو بسيطة في قصة نجاح النموذج الإماراتي في مواجهة كوفيد-19. أما الأمر الثالث والأخير وهو مطلب متجدد يتمثل في ضرورة تعزيز العمل المشترك بين المراكز البحثية والإقليمية والعالمية، بما يعكس تحسين وتطوير آليات عملها ودورها المستقبلي. وأعتقد أن الجهود التي قام بها فقيدنا الغالي الدكتور جيم ماغان وبرنامج مراكز الأبحاث والمجتمعات المدنية في معهد لودر بجامعة بنسلفانيا في هذا الصدد كان في غاية الأهمية، ويجب أن نتواصل وأن تحظى وأن تحظى أيضا هذه الأفكار بدعمنا جميعا. ونحن في ترند سنواصل جهودنا لتعزيز الشراكات والتعاون في مختلف مراكز الأبحاث، وأشير فقط إلى أننا تمكنا في العامين الأخيرين من عقد ما مجموعه 106 شراكة مع مؤسسات بحثية وأكاديمية ومؤسسات رسمية إقليمية وعالمية. مرة أخرى أشكركم جميعا على حسن إنصاتكم، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muhammad. شكرا يا فندم. Thank you so much for talking about the new level of security that's existing in the world, the health security. We're not talking about armies and wars and fights, that the priority, the top agenda is the health security and the humane level. And definitely Emirates did a good job in coping with the COVID, and one of the things that helped actually is having a very strong IT infrastructure. And then finally, for his call for cooperation among the think tanks for the future. Okay, our next speaker, Milena Lazarovich. We've met a zillion times online, but this is the first time that we meet in person, so it's actually good to see her. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Abla, and thanks to the organizers for putting this together, and thanks to the entire TTCSP team for having managed to do this even without Jim physically present. It's definitely really, really weird to be back physically in a meeting with all of you and Jim not being there with us. I represent a small region, so it is a great honor for me to speak at the President's panel. Although it is a small region, I think that it kind of brings to light certain issues that are, to a large extent, related to the COVID pandemic, but as many of the previous speakers have mentioned, were actually rooted in problems that were existing before COVID. But COVID simply created opportunities to exacerbate and to show them even more clearly. And one issue that I want to focus on, because I'm not an economist, I don't want to speak about the economic recovery, but I do deal with governance, I do deal with democracy, I do deal with European Union and the enlargement of the European Union to my own region, the Western Balkans, or the Balkans. And that important issue are the values and what kind of a society we are living in now in this, let's say, new phase or second phase of the pandemic. What is the new normal that we are living, and what are the new circumstances to which we are, or maybe we're not getting accustomed. I come from a region that started to catch up with the mainstream EU, European Union, after in early 2000s, after a period of bloody civil wars that brought led to the dissolution of Yugoslavia. I have lived almost my entire, more than half of my life in a transition, in a period of democratic transition. Ever since I came back to Serbia after my studies abroad, I have been, and that's been 15 years now, over 15 years. I've been trying to contribute to the process of my country, Serbia, joining the European Union and joining this big value-based society. And one of these basic values is actually democracy and the functioning of democratic institutions, protection of the minorities, protection of human rights, and the rule of law, which was already mentioned. Yet, now, today, I find that my country is, in reality, not closer to these values and to the membership of the European Union than it was back in 2005, when I went back and started to work for the government's European Integration Office. And I think that most of the let's say, the blame for this protracted process of democratic transition, not only in my country, but in the rest of the region, is actually rooted in the problems of Europe's own democracy. Our colleagues from the Center for European Studies did recently a study on how COVID affected democracy in Europe, in the EU, in fact, at large. And they concluded that while before the pandemic, Europe was rated as the second most democratic region in the world by the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, with 93% of the countries classified as democracies, the quality of Europe's democracy has been declining for the past 10 years, but that this has been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. And that the pandemic actually was used by national governments to strengthen the executives and in many cases weaken the parliaments, and also decrease the freedom of the media. And although a majority of the EU's countries remain consolidated democratic systems, according to the Freedom House Nations in Transit report, several EU member states are now semi-consolidated democracies. And interestingly, all of those semi-consolidated democracies are located closer to my region in Central and Eastern Europe, in countries which joined the European Union between 2004 and 2013. Now, what does this show? This actually shows that democracy is not something that is built over a decade, over 2 decades, or even over 1 generation, and that is not something that you can take for granted. And crises such as the COVID pandemic are extremely easy to be used to curtail democratic institutions, to decrease transparency of the government's work, to start by default running public procurements as secrets without possibility for the public to scrutinize where money is going, decreasing freedom of access to public information, etc., etc. All of very important, let's say, emanations of the quality of Europe's democracies in general. Now, what about the Western Balkans, my region? The same organization, Freedom House, categorizes all the 6 countries of my region as transitional or hybrid regimes. The only EU country which is also a hybrid regime now is Hungary. And our own analysis, which we did in our regional Think for Europe network, also concluded that the way in which the COVID-19 crisis was handled in the Western Balkans has amplified existing cracks in the region's unconsolidated democratic systems, along with problems related to rule of law and democratic performance. And in many cases, unconstitutional measures were taken by the governments, and measures which were imposed to fight COVID were done in an unconstitutional manner. And only in 2 countries, in North Macedonia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, the constitutional courts actually were strong enough to proclaim those measures as unconstitutional. In other countries, the constitutional courts did not act in the same way. Interestingly, autocratic tendencies in my region, and especially in my country, Serbia, are not necessarily related to, better discipline in imposing anti-COVID measures or even ensuring high vaccination rates. I come from a country which is, as I mentioned, now a hybrid regime with a very strong president who is breaching the country's paper constitution on a daily basis. Vaccines and a multitude of different vaccines are readily available to the population, yet despite the early successes and very swift mobilization of the vaccination efforts, Serbia still has below 50% of vaccinated population. And I think that this very clearly shows how lack of trust in the institutions negatively impacts people's decisions to get vaccinated. Interestingly, the highest vaccination rates in Europe are exactly in the parts of Europe where democracy is the strongest. And Central and Eastern Europe, in most of the Central and Eastern European region where democracies are weaker, vaccination rates are lower. And in my region, it's everywhere below 50%, in some countries such as Bosnia and Herzegovina, below 30%. Even though, again, as I said, vaccines are readily available to the populations. Now, how is all of this affecting EU's global position and its position vis-à-vis the Western Balkan region? And why am I bringing this into the story? Well, the EU's hesitancy, especially in the early days of the pandemic.
Melanie?
2 more minutes, perfect. To include the Western Balkan region in its COVID response and to treat it as part of the family, resulted in the increase of the influences of non-EU actors in the region, and particularly China. Effectively, this has pulled the region away from the EU's zone of sphere of interest and influence, and it has undermined the sense of belonging to the EU among the region's populations. Serbia is now the only country in the region where just slightly above 50% of the population actually wants the country to join the European Union, and the large majority of the population believes that Serbia will never make it into the European Union, although my region and Serbia are geographically already inside of the European Union. We are surrounded by EU member states. China has used the COVID crisis as an opportunity to increase its political influence in the region, and its political influence, which was also increased by its COVID and vaccine diplomacy, remains much stronger than its actual economic influence in the region. For example, 78% of all investments, foreign direct investments in Serbia come from the EU, and only 7% from China. Yet, the Serbian media and the Serbian politicians mainly speak more about Chinese investments than about European investments. The problem here is that China does not even invest in my country. China offers loans. The EU is giving, making investments. The EU is making grants and giving money as development aid, but China is getting all the credit. Now, my point, and this is where I will finish, is that the European Union needs to assert its influence in, first of all, in this region where it is already almost, let's say, entirely physically present, which is already surrounded by its territory. There is a lot of effort to build back a stronger union, which is now going through the process of building the so-called European strategic autonomy, which includes many COVID-related adjustments, but also, for example, European Health Union. And these efforts must include 2 important pillars. One, strengthening Europe's democracies and investing in democratic institutions, and in parallel, the process of keeping the Balkans close and ensuring that the process of defending the EU's democracy goes hand in hand and is the same and connected process with investing in the democracies in the region which I come from. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Melanie. Thank you so much. Talked about the effect of democracy on the trust of government and how all of this is impacting on the COVID situation and the vaccination, and how some measures were unconstitutional in nature. This is something I think we need to talk about and understand more after the session, because there is no time. And then the special situation of Serbia. Trust is a very key issue in the area of vaccination, and the link to democracy is definitely important. Now, last but not least, okay, the continent which is the lowest level of vaccination and have always had poverty issues forever and still not receiving enough attention, Africa. Mr. Vazu Gundan, please join us.
Thank you very much, Abla, and greetings to all of the delegates. Let me, at the outset, thank Deraset, TTCSP, and the government of Bahrain for hosting this very important conference. And I would be failing if I did not pay my respects to the family of Jim McCann, a tireless soldier for the think tanks across the world. And coincidentally, my own father passed on a day after Jim. They were in many ways kindred spirits. Whilst Tim worked tirelessly for think tanks, my father was a tireless freedom fighter in South Africa. And being a veteran of our liberation struggle, he was awarded a state funeral by our president. And so we celebrate his life whilst we celebrate Jim's life as well. Abla, I want to cover two issues. Firstly, the current situation in Africa, and secondly, the role of think tanks. So if we look at the topic and particularly the impact of COVID, we know that COVID was a health crisis, which in Africa, as with the rest of the world, led to an economic crisis. And what we are bracing ourselves for in Africa is a coming major security crisis that will lead to a humanitarian crisis. So if we look first at the health crisis, we know now, as many of the speakers have alluded to, that vaccine discrimination driven by nationalism, fear, and greed has prevented us globally, and particularly here in Africa, from effectively mitigating the effects of the virus. One of the speakers mentioned that only 3.6% of 1.4 billion people in Africa have been vaccinated with a double dose. And we know that there were countries in the world that had purchased right up front even 4 times the amount of vaccines they needed. If they had not done that and the vaccines were distributed more equitably across the world, we may not be in the situation that we are in today. And we know that even though Europe had much of the vaccine up front, today it has not prevented a rise in infections in Europe. In fact, they have a major crisis in Europe, and now we are seeing new variants. And by the way, I should, for the record, since we are on the public record, say that we in South Africa just discovered the Omicron variant because of our excellent scientists in South Africa. The virus itself, the variant, did not originate in South Africa. Our epidemiologists just discovered it and then shared it with the rest of the world. But unfortunately, today we are getting penalized by the rest of the world with travel bans when this virus is now in many parts of the world. This morning I read that it is already in 15 states in the United States. Now, this kind of discrimination impacts quite seriously on the economies of different countries across the world, not least of all my own country. We rely heavily during this period of the vacation on inward tourism, and the travel bans will really have a huge devastating impact, not only on the economy of our country, but I know, Abla, your own country, Egypt, will see a lot of tourists around this period also, and many other countries in Africa. So Africa's economies have been seriously affected by this crisis, moving from relative stability to recession, and some now even moving into depression. And this has led to a loss of livelihoods across the continent, as it has in many parts of the world. And what we have not been able to assess yet, which is what some of the speakers have again alluded to, is what will be the mental health crisis. I was speaking to some psychiatrists in my own city who say that they have never seen so many patients. It's an unprecedented number of patients who are presenting with mental health problems as a consequence of not just the health crisis, but the economic crisis. Now, we know also on our continent that the economic crisis will lead to a security crisis. Many countries in Africa are experiencing conflict, not just wars, but social and political crises caused by rapid urbanization into unplanned cities with weak economies and no provision of basic services. Now, COVID lockdowns, which are necessary, have put a dangerous lid on conflict. And when it is lifted, conflict will come back, as we predict, with a vengeance. In addition, we are dealing with several ongoing civil conflicts and civil wars, the most significant, as many of you know, being the civil war in Ethiopia and Sudan. Of course, we know that the virus does not stop at the door of war, nor do people who are engaged in wars wait for a virus to end. So the ongoing war in Ethiopia and the civil conflict in Sudan, both of which are now on the global stage will exacerbate the spread of the virus, leading to a vicious cycle we fear here on the continent. And we know already we see a humanitarian crisis in Ethiopia, and we predict that once we see a rise in social and political conflict with the lifting of this lid, with governments being reluctant to reinstate all liberties, and we see a rise again, as John Allen indicated right at the beginning, a rise of authoritarianism across the world. Africa will not be spared this trend also. And the lockdowns of COVID will not be lifted easily. So we are bracing ourselves for a very, very dangerous situation as we move into the future. And let me then try to conclude then with the role of think tanks in all of this. The role of think tanks in Africa is likely to become even more important in the future, taking into account, as I said, a number of significant trends, such as a changing international global order and an increasingly integrated African continent, but also a continent facing a number of significant challenges and opportunities, including population growth, urbanization, technological developments, and the knowledge economy, and perhaps the most significant, as John Allen indicated right at the beginning, climate change. These changes are fast converging in Africa and presenting governments with challenges that are increasingly beyond their ability to respond to alone. Some governments work with think tanks, research institutions, and the private sector to address these challenges. We ourselves have been engaged with the African Union in a continent-wide conflict, the first of its kind, to look at the impact of COVID on conflict. And in 2 weeks' time, we will present here in my city, Durban, to the African Union Peace and Security Council, the findings of that study. However, there are other governments that see think tanks as a problem because they generate data that may expose policy gaps, mismanagement, and corruption. In a global environment of global polarization and authoritarianism, a clampdown on think tanks is not far-fetched, and in some countries, this is already occurring. These challenges, Abla and colleagues, will provide new opportunities for think tanks to prove their value by providing quality, evidence-based research, policy advice, and support to governments and multilateral institutions. A more active role that goes beyond merely providing research to one that works with governments to turn policy into practice may be required to ensure that think tanks have a greater part in the development agenda so that we can turn an approaching Dickensian winter of despair into a spring of hope. Thank you very much, Abla, and my greetings again to all of your participants and our deep condolences to the family of Jim McCann.
Thank you so much, Fazil, for a very interesting participation. And again, our condolences on the passing away of your father, and great same time as James, actually. And hopefully, great people always give good memories, and things would get better from there on. It's difficult to say more about things like that. You talked about the case of Africa, which is not good. Economically, they've always been underprivileged, and they continue to do so with the vaccination, and definitely any new lockdowns are going to affect us even more. Thanks for correcting the misconception that it did not start in South Africa, but South Africa is definitely being penalized at this point. And we are all going to be penalized as part of the process by not receiving tourists and having all sorts of changes in the world, and also for touching upon the civil war in Ethiopia and how the situation in Africa needs a lot of attention. Definitely think tanks and the value of their contribution is very critical, and will become even more critical as we go on. Now, our official time is up, but we're supposed to have Q&A, but with 7 speakers, we need more than an hour and a half. But since I still have the mic, and we had the technology problem with one of the speakers, all right, and we had to wait for the guy to come and so on, I'm going to benefit from this situation and give room for one question from the floor, please, but make it brief. Yes, please go ahead.
So, my name is Petre Platon Claudio. I'm from Romania National Administration Association. COVID crisis is a health crisis and also a public administration crisis. So we, in a way, import bureaucracy, and they right now benefit unchecked power. One challenge, in my opinion, is that we have to check that power, the power of the public administration. All the problems arise that Milena mentioned with constitutional courts annulling decisions of government and so on. First of all, based on public administration decisions. So one challenge is to make the public administration function effectively. And the second is that low vaccination rates in states that can afford to have vaccines, like in the European Union. It's the case of disinformation, especially in the Balkans and in the Central and Eastern Europe, where I am from. So, questions, how do we address these two challenges? One, to check the unchecked power of the public administration, and the second, how do we fight against disinformation in areas where Russian and Chinese propaganda is very well present there? Thank you very much for Guido, for Milena, because they are from that area, geographic area. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll also read you a question that we received online. How can we revise our health policies to enforce vaccine mandates on everyone to curb further strains of variants of COVID and enhance our herd immunity? I think I can take another point from here, okay? Because I decided to take the 5 minutes, so I hope that I will not. I have 10? Oh, this is. Oh, this is so sweet of you. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Then we can have more. Let's have more questions, and then I'll give a chance to the panel to respond as they see relevant to their expertise. Any other questions here? Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'm Walid Al-Khatib from the Center for Strategic Studies at the University of Jordan. Thank you for the speakers and for the valuable information they provided in this session. But actually, we couldn't until now see what role should the think tank have in the government, advising the government how to move forward in the after COVID-19 or with the COVID-19. As we said, it might end, it might not end. So it's moving with us. Also, the advice was to give those think tanks a better role or a stronger role in shaping or advising the policymakers on the new roadmap after the COVID-19. So we know that different techniques, methods have been used in different countries how to tackle the COVID-19. Some countries have completely locked down. Some countries actually said everyone is free to go and let's have the herd immunity and so on. And also we have the conspiracy theory against the vaccine at the beginning, saying it might affect you, affect your health. Pfizer is not actually a vaccine. It's something new we haven't used before. The validity of those vaccines and so on. So we need actually to think further than what is our role should be and how actually we should impact those policymakers by having these, professional studies. I'd like to thank Trends, actually. They are the only ones who spoke about their role in advising the government. We at CSS have implemented many surveys about the population opinion or the Jordanian opinion against the vaccine, the lockdown, and so on. And the government listened to us at the beginning, but when we changed the government, the prime minister, they stopped listening to us. So things went in the wrong direction. So sometimes actually think tanks have a role, and a valuable role, and they can be listened. And thank you.
Thank you so much. Any other questions? Okay. Before I give back and give a chance for the panel to respond, let me just respond to the last point here, because I belong to a think tank myself. Okay. All think tanks did studies. At ECS, we've done something like 30 sectoral studies to check the impact of COVID on the different sectors. We even predicted the situation for several months after and put the recommendation for change. They were sent to the president of the country and to the government, and many were taken into actually consideration in implementation. So a lot of this is happening at the local level. What is still not happening, I think, is more at a broader level, at the regional level and at the international level. And this is the catch, given that we are all in the same boat. When you talk about the obstruction in the supply chains that's happening, this is an international problem that's affecting everything at the same time. What are we doing about it collectively? So what actions need to be taken? There is still a lot more that needs to be done. Let me pass on to the audience the questions. Who would like to respond or comment? I can start with you, Milena. Go ahead, ladies first.
Yes, thanks for the question on curbing the public administration. And when I was speaking about the executives, I included the public administrations in that. I mean, as somebody who deals with public administration and public administration reform, I mean, I can just say that the only toolbox which we have includes a strong civil society, which includes also strong think tanks. Vibrant, strong, and well-organized civil society which can investigate, which can analyze, which can expose problems of corruption, unconstitutional measures, bring them to the public, bring them to the media, mobilize and organize the public. Of course, none of these mechanisms are perfect. In my country, we also resort a lot to communication with international partners and trying to also use international cooperation and integration processes to pressurize the government into obeying by their own constitutional and statutory obligations when it comes to the actions of the government itself, but also of the public administration. And I would just point out that I don't think that it is the public administration per se which is in the origin of these problems. I think it is always the political establishment and the government which is actually instrumentalizing the administration in this pandemic, at least in the cases that I know best. Regarding the question on disinformation, I was going to mention it as a problem. I don't deal with that myself. I don't know what is the solution, but I do see that in our region, disinformation is particularly strong, perhaps because there aren't sufficient mechanisms for fighting disinformation. But I leave it at that.
Thank you. Okay, Gustavo, please go ahead.
Thank you. No, to refer to the second point of the first question, you mentioned the disinformation. I think ideology is important, but more than those problems, is that I think that, I don't know if it's a solution, but the education is very important because, especially in my region, in my country. And another point is don't use vaccination as a tool of politics, because people are realizing that it's happening, at least in my region. That's the result of the last elections in Argentina or in Chile against the governments.
Thank you. Okay, Diego, please.
Yes, thank you. I think that the think tanks think tanks are thought not only to act as a university, only investigating, researching, but to recommend. Then we have a political role, not only a research role, but a political role. And in relation with the important issue of pandemic, we should recommend to the governments on this problem. For example, recommend vaccination. And vaccination all over the world to avoid multiplication of variants, because it's a question of time. If we don't act, there will be another variants, another Omicrons in next times. We have to increase health spending by the governments. We have to fight misinformation, and we have to implement transparency. And I said, we have ahead of us immediately a meeting of G7 in Liverpool, and we have to recommend G7 solidarity to vaccinate all the world.
Agreed
Okay.
with you completely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, please.
Well, thank you. I have a few comments here. Firstly, I think as we move ahead, we should avoid the politics of the pandemic. We've seen how over the last year and a half, the politics of the pandemic have slowed down global efforts everywhere. So I think we are in it together, and we'll have to keep that in mind. Secondly, I think the role of Big Pharma needs to be re-evaluated. We need to nudge them to move in the direction of standardization in the fight against the COVID pandemic. The COVID pandemic requires us to have similar means in order to fight all the variants, since they are capable, they are fungible today. Just as oil and international money is, the virus is also fungible. It's going to move around. And so we need standardization there. That will take a little bit of rethinking on their part in terms of the profit motives. The world, I think, also needs to avoid fracturing the global community along what I might call selective globalization. For globalization is like a genie. It cannot be put back in the bottle. We shouldn't try to be selective in who we will now deal with and keep open our trade and travel and interaction with. And lastly, during this rather vulnerable phase, we don't know when it will come to an end, we need to have greater vigilance against disruptions, against militaristic opportunism, financial exploitation, and above all, fake narratives. And I think all think tanks have a role to play here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To say the specific role of the think tanks was not the purpose of this specific session. The first session was simply setting the stage by showing what's happening in the world, and I think we did a very good job, and I thank all my panelists. The silver lining of COVID, again, is for us to realize that we're all together in this. We need to act together. Think tanks are starting to talk. Countries are starting to talk. Talking is great. We need to walk the talk in the future to really see action out of this talking. Before I close the session, I want to particularly thank Zuha and the entire team, the army, Jim's army, who actually arranged this. And I want them to stand up. Can you please stand up to be recognized by people? Please stand up, all students of Jim, okay? All students of Jim. Zoha, you're too small, but raise your hand so that they see you, okay? She was a very strong army on her own, and the rest of you. I thank you all. Yes, really, they deserve a big applaud. Okay, بالعربي عندنا بنقول اللي خلف ما ماتش. We say whoever has children has not died. So even though he does not have you as children, but I think he created an incredible army. So thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Our chair of the session, Abdullah Abdul Latif, the panelists, John Allen, Gustavo Martinez, Diego Lopez Garrido, Sujan Archinoy, Muhammad Abdullah Ali, Milena Lazarovich, and Vasu Gwandin. Thank you so much.